thinking about it, we will record since it seemed to work yesterday. I got that uploaded so that you can find that recording of the Zoom meeting from yesterday up on the Sailing Center website. I did realize when I was kind of looking back through it, nobody told me that you really can't see the green marker. So we won't use the green marker anymore. I found a blue one we'll use instead. So hopefully that'll help out a bit. It was like, you kind of see it as like a smudge, but not any clear defined line. Dan, what are you doing over there? Are you sawing something?
We're making some bailers.
Ah, I see. What is that equipment you got there? Is that a hacksaw?
One hacksaw, one vise, and
All right, that honestly probably works a lot better than trying to go around with a razor knife. So I'll give you that. Well, there we go. We got dinner and a show. Minus dinner, I suppose. The whole meeting is just watching Dan make this baler. All right, we got 16 people in here. Give maybe another minute. Let's see. So yeah, we got Claire. We have Gracie. I think we've seen Gracie before. We got Kyle. We got Taya. Hey, everybody. Did I hear Lucy in there somewhere? I thought I heard the little Josh. Maybe not. Maybe it was just a normal Josh.
I didn't josh you, but I can.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Josh.
Hey, and Tim's here too. Hello, Tim. All right. Well, I guess let's. Oh, now we're hammering on the baler. Is that is that to knock out the little scoop? Cool. All right. Anyway, we may as well go ahead and get started. So today, again, was drawing material from a book. We won't be reading out of the book, but Frank Bethwaite, High Performance Sailing. I guess he was like a pilot and a meteorologist was his career, and then he realized, man, from doing all that stuff, I know a whole bunch about, you know, air and water and how they work together and weather systems. And what if I applied them to sailing and figured out how to sail better using all that information? And so it's a pretty thick book that he came up with. It is definitely not like light reading. It's not a cover to cover read. It's probably honestly closer to like a textbook, but it's got some interesting stuff. And so we'll see if I was able to pick out some good material for us. So what we're looking at today is kind of the differences between light breeze or light air and what his terminology is. He says there's light air and there's breeze, and there's a difference between them. So we'll look at that. So a couple real quick vocabulary words that don't super pertain to practical sailing, but they'll be interesting in terms of discussion today. So one is probably stuff you've heard before in like science class or something. One is viscosity. You kind of think of this as like almost like stickiness. I guess the technical definition is going to be resistance to deformation. So if you think of it as like, you know, you've got your maple syrup is very viscous. It doesn't like to run. Water is not as viscous as syrup. It will easily spill out of a glass if you tip it over. And so air also has a viscosity. It has it has a resistance to having its shape changed by something acting on it. And for water, its stickiness or not wanting to change shape is going to increase as temperature increases, which is kind of opposite of how a liquid like syrup would work. Then we have laminar flow. And so this is basically saying if you've got a fluid moving along somewhere, laminar flow is all that fluid is moving in the same direction, the same speed. It's not jumbling around. Everything's moving in one line. So that's laminar flow. And then turbulent flow would be if we do have sort of a jumble, like if you pour water out of a glass, the water's all kind of tumbling around in itself. So those end up kind of being his light air, he says, is laminar flow, and more than light air becomes turbulent flow. So we'll look at how that works in a second. The other thing would be boundary layer. So that goes along with the last couple things we mentioned. And this is going to be if you've got fluid moving past a surface, like we could imagine water moving past our boat, or air moving over a sail, or air moving over the surface of the water. Anytime there's two things coming in contact with each other, think of it in, so using the specific example of air and water, right? There's a very definite line where the air meets the water, and where the air is touching the water, the air is moving at the same speed as the water. It connects to the water. So right at that tiny boundary line right there, there's no motion of the air. As you get further away from the surface of the water, the air starts being able to move a little faster, until it gradually gets up to a point where it's at its full speed. So that wind right here is going to be faster than the wind right here, and the wind up here is going to be more than anything down low. And so the boundary layer is kind of this whole area at which you don't have the air at its full speed, because it is being affected by the water. So we'll get into a little bit more into that in a second too. A lot of this is like crazy weird science words, and how do they actually apply to us? And they're once we kind of get into like the actual how this is working, it'll be a little easier to understand, and also we'll realize it can actually affect us. And then the last thing, not really related to any of those, but just a term in case we haven't seen it before, twist, speaking about sails specifically. So when you have your sail on your boat, right, it's a big triangle, and it's made of cloth, and so it's flexible, right? So if we're able to look at it from the top, it kind of looks like this. If we imagine we're looking from right here down to there, it looks like that. Right where it is on the boom, maybe it looks like this. Up way at the top of the sail, it might look something like this, right? It's starting to kind of fold back as it goes up the sail, because all our controls down here, our outhaul and stuff, they are easily able to control the portion of the sail down near the foot, down near the bottom, but it's harder and harder to use something right here to control something up there when this whole thing is flexible. And most sails are a lot stiffer than your t-shirt, right? So we are able to control these. So we do actually have some control over how much twist our sail has, whether it's mostly following the same line as what's on the boom, or if it's opening more up near the top. We can control that, especially with like the vang. So that's twist. All right, so now getting into actual everything.
It was what the vang was made to do back in Paul Edstrom's days. That's what he was taking a look up there and going, man, I wish I
If
could
only there were a
control
way
the
to
twist
fix
of my
that.
sail. And then you can also get real fancy with it using traveler and backstays. But obviously FJs and 420s don't have those.
That is correct. So we'll leave those out of the discussion. Thank you for the insight, though. But yes,
But
on bigger boats, there's a
can-
lot more controls because there's a lot more boat.
But
Anyway,
you
so
can become the bridle on a 420.
getting back into what we're trying to talk about. So like we said, Frank Bethwaite separated. So if you remember, what was it, last Friday, we talked about, I kind of broke down light air and medium air and heavy air for looking at the ease hike trim deal. So we're going to use those same breakdowns where light air is basically, 0 to 5 knots. And then medium air is maybe 5 or 6 to, I don't know what it might be, 12, 14 knots, something like that when we're fully hiking all the time. And then heavy air is anything above that when we're just hiking all the time and we have to ease our sails to keep the boat upright. So we're going to use those same breakdowns here. And so light air in 0 to 5 knots, that's when the wind, so the wind is going to be actually acting differently than in stronger wind, right? It's not just that there's less wind, it's actually acting differently. So in light air, the wind is acting as a laminar boundary layer. And so what we mean by that, if we kind of go back through again, is that we've got, I got a blue marker. We'll use that for water. And then we'll say air is orange. So we've got the water down here, and we've got air down here, right at the surface of the water. Like we said before, this air that's touching the water is motionless. The air just above it, going a little bit faster. It can't go a lot faster though, because remember, we have that thing called viscosity. It's almost like friction. We've got these two layers of air. They're separate almost. So this layer on top can't move as fast as it wants to because it's sliding against the layer below it. And same with the next layer up. It can move a little bit faster than the second layer, but it still can't go as fast as it wants to. So you keep going up, and your boundary layer ends up being about 10 meters up in the air. He's Australian. He's using the metric system, but this is 10 meters is like 30 feet, 33 feet, whatever the case might be. So 30 feet up in the air is when we actually get the full wind speed of what's going on around us. And there's to go from, if this is 5 knots up here and 0 knots down here, there's going to be kind of a linear change. So if we have our mast of our sailboat, think about when you stand up in the boat. If you're 5 feet tall or 5.5 feet tall, whatever it is, you don't come up very far on the sail, right? But there's a good portion of the mainsail, a good portion of the jib that's in that 5 feet above the water. So that's at a certain speed. And then go above your head. Imagine if you could stand on your own shoulders, and now you're 10 feet up in the air. Now there's that portion of the sail. It's getting smaller, right? But the air is getting farther away from the water. It's able to start going faster. And now we get up to the way top of the sail, which is only about 18 feet off the water. And that air is going to be moving even faster than the stuff way down here. But that's the smallest portion of our sail, right? I could be kind of drawing this out here. The point of our sail way up top where we have the most wind is the smallest part of our sail. It turns out though that because we do have this wind speed difference from the bottom up to the top, there's going to be like the top quarter of your sail is going to be providing most of your driving force in light wind, just because there's so much difference in wind speed there. So if we think about 0 down here, 5 up here, by the time, 5 at 30 feet, 5 knots at 30 feet in the air. So by the time we're up 20 feet in the air, 15 feet in the air, something like that, we're probably sitting around 2.5 to 3 knots. And down here, maybe it's more like 2, or whatever the gradient might be. I don't know exactly what your numbers would look like in there, but there's going to be a lot more wind up near the top. So what that means is the top of our sail is what we really need to be paying attention to in that light breeze. So we talked maybe just yesterday about telltales on the mainsail, and that they are, we do need them, right? So this is, in this light air, these are really important right up near the top. You know, that telltale coming off the top batten of the mainsail, that's the most important sail trim helper that we have in that kind of breeze. So this is probably the answer to the question that we hear a lot in light air, which is, my boat looks, I'm doing everything exactly the same as the faster boats, so why am I not going as fast? And maybe it's because our boat in this big box here does look the same as everybody else, but maybe it's the part up here that looks different, right? And that's probably the part we're not really paying attention to. But we need to have a lot of, we end up needing to have a lot of twist in our sail. And I should probably draw out why that is to kind of help illustrate that. So basically, because there's more wind up near the top of our sail, our apparent wind is going to change. So down near where the boat is, you know, where we've got the biggest part of our mainsail, if we have, if I can pick up a boat, it's like stuck to the board right now. So here's our boat. If we have the true wind direction coming from here, remember this from Friday when we were talking about all this apparent wind stuff. We've got our motion forward, and so our apparent wind is somewhere like this. So that's our situation down near the boat, right, where the true wind is going to be pretty low. Now as we move up, we're coming up the mast, so my hand's moving towards you. Maybe we're 10 or 12 or 15 feet up in the air now, and this true wind arrow is getting a lot bigger, because like we just said, the higher you are above the water, the more wind you're going to have. So as this arrow gets a lot bigger, it's going to take your apparent wind arrow and pull it around so that it's a lot closer to that true wind angle, which means we're still on the same boat, right? Where our boat hasn't done anything different, but the bottom of the sail is feeling a different apparent wind than the top of the sail. And like we said before, the boat doesn't know that there's anything other than apparent wind. It only knows what it feels. So true wind doesn't matter. It doesn't know that there's such a thing as true wind. It only knows about apparent wind. So down below, maybe we are in a close hauled course. Our main sail down near the boom is trimmed all the way in, but way up top, we need that sail to be open, because up top, the top of the mainsail needs to be eased, right? So if we could set up our sail so that the bottom looks like this and the top looks like that, now we might have both of them trimmed correctly. And I would say again, to just reemphasize, it is going to be the top that we kind of want to pay attention to more, because that's got so much more wind speed available to it. So that's kind of what we want to be dealing with in the light air stuff. We got to have a lot of twist in the sail and pay attention to that top of the mainsail. The other thing, just with kind of the overall strategy for your race course in light air, is that if we know that we kind of have two different things we can choose between. If we're looking at our overall strategy, you know, in lieu of having any boats on the race course, how would we get around the course fastest? We can pick either following the best wind direction, or we can follow the best wind speed. And in light air, when we have this kind of breeze, the real low, 5 knots or less, it's basically always going to be wind speed that wins. So we're not necessarily caring about whether we're on the best lifted tack. You know, we don't necessarily care if we're on a lift or we're on a header. As long as we're in wind and moving well, it doesn't matter if we go a little extra distance. So if we only chase the direction, if we realize, hey, look, the wind has changed a little bit, I'm getting headed, so I'm going to tack. Well, if I tack into a big calm spot, a big dead spot, that's not going to work for me because obviously you're not going to move. So just making sure we're in the light air, we're looking for the wind speed. More wind is better. Even if we have to go a bit farther to get to it or to stay in it, it's going to be way better to go out to the corner here and come back in than to take our shortest distance to the mark, as long as we can be in wind. Cool. So that's our light wind. That's what we're looking for there. So that's our laminar flow. We have layers of wind that progressively get more and more wind speed as they get up above the water. Now, back to the categories. We're moving up to kind of medium wind, right? So now we can actually call it breeze. So now this is when we get into turbulent flow. So what's happening at that kind of physical weird words level is that the laminar flow is caused because there's that viscosity. The air doesn't want to, the air in different layers can't move faster than a certain speed because it's being held back. But once the wind gets enough energy behind it, we have a greater wind speed once you get out of the boundary layer. We've got enough energy that the viscosity isn't able to hold that air into layers anymore. And so it all just breaks down and just starts churning and jumbling all over the place. And so at that point, as soon as you leave the water, there's maybe like a 3-foot layer where you do have still that kind of laminar flow. But think about distances. 3 feet off the water is about where our boom starts, right? So our whole entire mainsail is in this one big single speed of wind. We've got this turbulent flow that is constantly mixing throughout here. And so there's no opportunity for different layers, different wind speeds to stay separate. They're all mixed in. So as soon as we get up to that type of wind speed, it's all the same, whether it's the bottom of our mainsail or the top. So now we have all these sail controls, such as the vang, and we want to make sure we're using them to take away the twist in our sail. We want to have as little twist as possible because we've got, all the way from the bottom of the sail to the top, we've got the same wind speed. That means we have the same apparent wind over the whole thing, which means that our sail all the way from the bottom of the top to the top wants to be at the same angle to the wind. So we're trying to have as little twist as possible. The newer your sails are, the easier it is to do that. Once you get to very old sails that really do feel like a t-shirt, then it's going to be a lot harder. But fortunately, we have newer sails that are a lot stiffer, and they are able to kind of eliminate that twist. So that's for your breezy conditions when we're getting up into that medium breeze. But yeah, so turbulent flow, it's mixing all around. The apparent wind is the same all the way from the bottom of the sail up to the top. All right, so now we've got, so we can talk a little bit about puffs. How do they work in this different kinds of breeze? So in lighter air, you're looking around and the water is pretty much all flat unless you see a puff, and then you'll see those little ripples, those little cat's paws coming along, right? So that's the wind speed stuff that you're looking for. And in the lighter wind, those are often a little more unpredictable. They kind of come down where they're able to, because there's a little bit of stuff that's able to mix in. But in general, it's something that happens on accident is a weird way to describe it because it's all just sort of a random cycle. But it's not really any pattern or predictability to the puffs you'll get in light breeze, as we found a lot when we're sailing in light breeze, right? It's often just kind of, it sometimes just comes down to the other guy got lucky and passed me, even if he was, he could have been 100 feet away and he got the breeze and I didn't. So there's not a lot of predictability there. Once you get up to that those breezy conditions where we're in that turbulent flow, everything's mixing around. Rather maybe not very intuitively, because we're saying, yeah, everything's mixing around. The puffs and the lulls are actually a lot more predictable in the breezier conditions. So what we're looking for there is, once we have kind of enough wind that we're kind of in those breezy conditions, then everything's kind of ripples over the water, right? So now you're looking for, instead of the shape, instead of all those little ripples, now to find a puff, we're looking for that big kind of dark patch on the water. It's often going to be kind of a circle or an oval shape coming downwind, and you can just see that dark patch coming down. And if you're in a position where you can get to it, especially going downwind is often when it's easiest to actually move over to one. But that's the sort of thing you're looking for. So it was interesting reading through a couple of his chapters, because he's got just a lot of data, and he says this stuff it's actually kind of as a general rule, it's going to be like 30 seconds or so between a gust and then a lull, and then a gust and then a lull, which I thought it was interesting that he was able to find that much of a pattern among like just every sailing location. And I don't know everywhere that he's tested, but certainly regardless of the numbers, any puffy conditions we have here, we can kind of time them, and depending on the location, we can figure out what's the timing in between these puffs, so we can kind of be ready and looking for them. And then your wind direction is also going to slowly oscillate back and forth. Whether that's, I guess that'd be a little bit separate from like a big wind shift, but typically, I guess it's like 10 to 15 degrees you'll usually see over the course of several minutes, kind of just swinging back and forth a little bit. So that's kind of another thing that you can kind of look for in conditions where you're looking for the favored tack or something like that. Because now that we get to the breezy conditions, and we've got some puffs, but now we've got everything's kind of a bit more predictable. So now we're looking for we're still looking for more wind speed because of those puffs, but we can start paying attention to the direction as well, right? If kind of everybody is getting the same puffs and we're all in the same breeze, there's not little random things that come up like in light air. We're still paying attention to that wind speed, but we can also start looking around for those better tacks to be on. So when we realize we've been headed, we can think about tacking over to get on the lift, and that sort of thing. And then once we move up to, remember that phrase, the design wind. So we're fully hiking. It's turned into heavy air for us, and we can basically assume at that point that that's the fastest the boat is going to go, because anything more than that, and now we have to ease sails to keep the boat upright, but that means we're spilling away some power, so we're not going to increase speed. So that design wind is kind of the fastest the boat is going to go. Obviously planing would be the exception, but not too many boats we sail are able to plane, especially upwind. 420 obviously will go downwind and sometimes upwind, but if you're in an FJ, then it's not typically going to play a plane either direction. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so anyway, once we get up to that stronger breeze where we're just easing sails and trimming back in to keep the boat upright, then we don't care so much about wind speed. It might honestly be detrimental because we're just focusing so much on keeping the boat upright, we kind of start to lose track of other things. So now we're solely focused on finding the best angles that we can to get up to the mark the fastest. So one more thing about puffs, which was kind of interesting when I was reading this. I remembered learning about this from Stovey like back in high school and had completely forgotten about it until recently when I read this again. But basically, if we have our puff, it's kind of coming down. Remember I said it's kind of like a circle or an oval is usually the shape that hits the water and then is moving downwind. So this is our increased wind speed coming down towards us. And then we've got our normal wind speed everywhere else. But if we look at this, this puff isn't, it's not, these blue arrows don't mean that the brown arrows just somehow got faster. This is an actual new mass of air that's come down and it's hit the water and it is moving down towards us. So it's not making these brown arrows faster, it's pushing these brown arrows out of the way, if that makes sense. So what happens is that we actually have what we'll kind of call a fan in front of this puff of all these, this normal wind speed, all these brown arrows getting pushed out of the way of this new mass of air that's coming down. Mass of, not massive, although I suppose you could call it either way. But it's getting pushed out of the way, which means that it might at certain, or it is at certain angles, it's pointing in a different direction than either the true wind, the normal wind, sorry, or the puff, right? So this is the fan. And as you're coming up to this puff, you'll encounter this kind of fan of wind, of air being pushed out of the way. And it's going to, for a brief moment, or maybe not so brief, depending on where you are, is actually going to be giving you a different wind direction. So probably a lot of you have experienced when you're sailing along and you can see the puff coming, you see that dark patch of water, but then right before it hits you, you get a big header and it goes away in like half a second and you're back into the puff. But that's what's actually going on, is that you hit this little fan, which was getting pushed away from the puff. So the angle changed. And for a second, you were headed above close haul. It gave you that header. But then you got into the puff and you kind of recovered and we're still going the same direction. So there's another reason. Remember we were talking yesterday about going, when you get into a puff or something, or you're going into a header, sail into it a little bit to make sure that it's actually doing what it says what it told you initially it was doing, right? So in this particular case, if we were kind of on a hair trigger and we said, oh, that's a header, we tack, then you might actually just be going out of the puff, right? So the other possibility that we have here is that if we're not sailing directly into the puff like this, maybe we're skirting around the edge. So if that happens, then we kind of we get like, I don't know what to call it. We get like an extra puff, right? So we're about to be hit by this puff, but first we get hit by this fan of air coming out. And if we look at this direction, you know, we're close hauled compared to the normal wind, but this fan is suddenly moving our true wind back a bit. It's taking the wind and making it like that. So this goes back to our ease hike trim stuff, because we got this change in wind speed. It's going to, or sorry, change in wind direction. It's going to change our apparent wind. It's going to shift our apparent wind farther back toward the back of the boat, which means we can ease, and we'll use our whole phrase. We'll ease, hike, go straight, and trim. So we'll take that extra speed and we'll keep going with it. Going downwind, you can also look at this. If you're able to move towards a puff, you can sometimes just get on and ride the fan instead of actually getting into the puff. You can stay right on the edge of it, and because it's changing your angle, you could almost stay on a reach, which we know is, especially in a boat that's planing like a 420, we can stay on the reach but be able to head further down because this angle is changing. So at a certain point, we might even be heading straight downwind as if we should be on wing, but we're riding the edge of this puff. So we're staying on a reach, which is going to be faster for us than actually wing on wing. And we have a couple more minutes. I think we're actually almost, let me restart because I don't want to get cut off in the middle. I think we got like 2 minutes more, but I've got another little bit to talk about. So we'll do the same thing as yesterday. I will restart Zoom. I think if you all stay there, it'll just bump you back in, or maybe you have to manually get back in. But let's do that real quick. Thank you. I forgot to do that yesterday, and so we're just missing the last 10 minutes or so of what we did yesterday. There we go. Recording is on.
Didn't we have like 20-something people before?
It was somewhere around 18, 20, something like that. So maybe we've lost a few, but we will have the recording if they don't make it back on. All right, cool. So yeah, I guess it's all a lot of new words, but when we're kind of able to break it down and look at the basic big pictures behind it, then it makes sense why we want to know all these things. Anyway, so I think I'd finish right with there. So the fan that's why you get that big header right before your puff. Depending on what sort of speed your boats have, you may or may not be able to do stuff like kind of riding the outside of that puff a long way downwind. But it is kind of one thing to consider is that if you're coming into it, if you can kind of see it coming down, then you could start to think, is that something that I actually want to kind of look forward to? And instead of sailing straight into the puff, maybe I tack a little before it so that when I get this fan coming down and hitting me, I can ease out those sails and keep going and just get some more speed. Or I can choose to not do that and keep myself trimmed in and just be pointing super high because I'm able to ride all the way along the outside of this puff and keep following that fan. And that's obviously going to be a very short-lived thing because that puff is going to run right by you. So and there's if you're not wanting to go that way, obviously don't. But it's certainly something that could give you kind of a fake lift for a while. So something you can kind of play with. But certainly when it's breezier, it is easier to see those puffs coming and kind of plan for them, especially on downwinds when we have usually a lot more freedom to kind of move back and forth than when we're going upwind and we have to choose which tack we're on. So if we were to kind of summarize the kind of what we're looking for in light wind versus breezy wind, we kind of say it like this. If remember we're choosing between wind speed and wind direction, right? So wind speed, if we can get it, makes us go faster, kind of obvious. Wind direction, we're looking for what takes us closer to the mark. So if we're headed, do we tack onto the lift and be able to point closer to the mark? If we're sailing like this and the wind does that, that means our boat has to go from here to here. Do we tack over? Because on this tack, our boat, instead of going like that, now can go like that. That's your header versus your lift. That's what we're looking for in our wind direction. So in light air, like we talked about, when we're creating that twist in the sail, we're paying attention to the top of the mainsail, and the puffs, when they show up, are very unpredictable in how long they'll last and where they'll come from and where they'll go to. So in that stuff, we're always going to choose wind speed. We're always going to find the puff and stay in the breeze as long as we can. That's what's going to win for us all the time. So light air, we're looking for wind speed, looking for puffs. Getting up to kind of our medium wind, right, and our breeze. Now we've got that turbulent flow. We don't have that laminar flow where there's different wind speeds depending on where you're looking at the sail. the whole sail is feeling the same wind. So now we're still mostly looking at wind speed, but we can start to look at our wind direction and kind of play that more into our tactics. If we don't have, either tack upwind is giving us the same speed right now. So now we're going to look for which tack is going to take us closer to the mark. There's definitely times that we've seen where, a certain place on the race course has a lot more breeze, especially if you're in more of an enclosed area. Like if we go to DC, there's definitely places there that you're like, you have to go left because that's where the breeze is. That's a time when the angles don't really matter. We're just trying to get to that wind because more wind is more speed. But I don't know. I totally lost the train of thought there. That was weird. So most you're keeping wind speed as a priority, but we are starting to look more at the wind direction. Then we move up to our heavier, strong wind. We're above our design wind. We're hiking out all the time. So really, really breezy. And now we're realizing that unless we can plane where we're going, in enough wind, a 420 will plane upwind. And certainly by the time you're up to 10, 12 knots, something like that, you can start to plane downwind, maybe more like 14 knots. But going, if you're in a boat that doesn't plane, so we'll use an FJ for the argument, then we're at our top speed already. We're not going to go any faster once the wind is that strong. So we don't care about more wind speed because it doesn't give us anything. So now we're just looking at the wind direction. We're figuring out which angle takes us closer to the mark. If you can plane, if you're in a boat that planes downwind, or if we're in a wind speed that would make us plane downwind but not necessarily upwind, then we're going to follow the wind direction upwind and we'll follow the wind speed downwind. So when you're planing, you're not restricted by that hull speed anymore that we talked about the other day. So there's no real limit to our top speed. The more wind we get, the more speed we have. So downwind, if we can plane, we're looking for those puffs. The more wind, the better. And then if we happen to be in a situation where we're even starting to plane upwind, then same kind of deal. The more wind we have, the more speed we have. So we're going to always be looking for those puffs. Cool. So I think that's all I had for there. Anybody have questions from here? And I've got notes put up on the website, and I will upload this recording too. So it'll be cool. Yeah, doesn't look like anybody is particularly inquisitive right now.
Taya has a question.
Whoops, Taya has a question. What's your question, Taya? Oh yeah, this scrolls all the way down. Wait, does Taya have a question? Maybe Taya.
Can you explain the boundary layer more?
Oh yeah, so the boundary layer that's maybe a thing that was kind of just like a little background information and isn't crazy relevant. But if we've got the water, and we know that so when we're saying like the actual wind speed, like if the land weren't there or the water wasn't there, what speed would the wind be going? So that's when we're saying wind speed right now. That is like that's our maximum number, right? So somewhere at some undisclosed distance up here, the wind is going at that speed. And then down here at the water, we know that the air that's touching the water isn't moving because the water's not moving. They're kind of stuck together. They have friction with each other. So this whole layer right here, this whole gap between 0 and full speed, that's the boundary layer. So when we've got that lighter wind and we've got that laminar flow stuff going on, then the boundary layer is made up of a bunch of different layers. So we've got, there's however thick it is, I don't know. But there's 0, and then there's a bit, and then there's a bit more, and there are these layers. The air in these layers doesn't mix because, like we said, laminar flow is everything's going the same speed, the same direction. So this guy that's maybe going 1 knot can't mix with this stuff that's going 2 knots. I'm sure the gradient is a lot smaller. There's not going to be a 1 knot jump, but just so you get the picture. So that's your laminar flow boundary layer. And I think he said it's about somewhere between 30 and 50 feet up in the air is where this boundary layer finally stops, and you've got the actual uninterrupted airflow. So in a bigger boat that's 50-foot boat that has a 70-foot mast, that certainly gets up into the whatever that breeze that is. But we definitely don't. Our masts are not 30 feet tall. So we're always operating in this kind of laminar flow system where the higher you go, the more wind you get. And so that's why we have to, we have to use that twist of our sail with our mainsail, and even with our jib, we can kind of play around with those jib leads, move them forward so that or whatever direction it would be, to make it so that the back edge of your jib is able to kind of spill open a bit, get a little more twist. So that's your boundary layer for your light air, and then your turbulent boundary layer, when we have higher wind speed, everything is mixing together because that viscosity, that kind of friction, is not keeping the layers separate anymore. It's too much force in the wind for it to stay separate anymore, and so now everything is kind of going where it wants to. And as soon as you get maybe 3 feet off the water, everything's the same speed. So I guess don't quote me completely on what I'm about to say, because I may have misunderstood what he was saying. The boundary layer for the actual boundary layer for this is going to get a lot bigger, like 1,000 feet up in the air. And so maybe the wind is 20 knots up there and it's 10 knots down at the water. So that difference, 10 knots and 1,000 feet, technically there is some change in here, but to change from 10 knots and 1,000 feet, then to change what the change in 20 feet is, we're not really going to be able to tell the difference. So that's why we're saying it's the same. And so yeah, that part I don't completely understand, because that's all totally new. I was basically just reading it today. But so I guess to the super long answer that I gave to answer your question is the boundary layer is just the difference between the water and the maximum speed of the wind. Not incredibly super relevant to remember that, but it's cool to know. Did that help?
Yeah, it helped. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I think probably the practical stuff that I had there is that when it's super light air, the wind speed changes the higher up we get off the water, which means that our sail needs twist. And in more breeze, when we're in that turbulent boundary layer, there is no wind speed gradient, so the apparent wind is the same over the whole sail. So we want no twist. I'd say that's probably the biggest thing you want to take away from that. All right. Any other last questions there?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, what's up? Go ahead.
And also kind of just a comment, but I was reading the other day about like recognizing puffs and being able to not just like recognize them, see them, but also communicate them to your skipper, like if you're from the perspective of a crew.
Sure.
So like I know we're not all there yet, but I read a little bit about how like you should be trying to time it as best you can, and then maybe giving like a countdown and then saying like breeze on and giving as much information to your skipper as you can if you see a puff, or, you know, communicating that information.
Mhm.
So just in terms of like that as a practical thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that's definitely one of those things that's like, when you're starting to try to do that and look, it's easy to look and say, oh, you know what, I see a puff coming. But figuring out how fast is that puff coming to me, how soon am I going to need to do all that ease hike trim stuff. That's another thing that can be put into practice is trying to count that down. Here's puff in 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1, here it comes. Or we know we're heading into it, so be ready for that quick little header in 3 seconds, and then the puff is going to hit us. And it's one of those things that you'll get the timing wrong at first, but we want to get the timing right eventually, so we have to do it a bunch and get the timing wrong. It's just like anything in sailing. Every time I see some of our newer skippers do a tack, like every single tack you do is wrong. I'll just say that right now, because there's so many little things that we haven't perfected yet. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do tacks. It means that we have to do those tacks wrong over and over. And so just like same thing here. Doesn't mean because you can't call the puff correctly yet that you shouldn't call the puff. We should still look ahead to it and count it down. And I was 3 seconds too early that time. So now I kind of have that little knowledge in the back of my head. Oh, okay, that time I was 5 seconds late. I thought it was coming a lot faster, or whatever. But certainly, yeah, with anything, just be willing to do it wrong for a little bit or a lot of it.
No, I think that means that you can't go a single race while you're tacking. You have to finish the entire race without tacking, because you can't do it perfect. So why do it at all?
I'd be impressed I guess you could just jibe every time, but yes, I get your point.
If I could add on there, Hannah, it does take a long time. I still haven't gotten it myself, but as long as you can, like, the 5 second difference is really nothing, because your skipper should be looking at the jib the whole time, and that puff will be in their peripheral. So really, if you can get it like within 20 seconds, like, this puff is worth going for. This puff is outside the ley line. If we tack, we'll be in that puff immediately, or we won't be. That's where you want to get it, because sailing doesn't really operate by seconds and time. It's much more of a feeling thing. So if you can get close, that's really all you need to get, unless your skipper is blindfolded, in which case, there you go.
Yeah, I guess another thing worth mentioning there is that, it's not always, you're not necessarily always looking for the puffs in a straight line, right? Maybe we need to know that, hey, if we tack right now, we're going to be like, a puff is going to hit us as we tack. So if we need to tack, that's fine, but we can't do as much roll as we normally do, because the puff is gonna tip us over if we do too much roll. So it's just a straight line ready for ease hike trim is also not the only thing we have to be looking for.
And another thing about the breeze is, as a crew, an easy thing to practice is just being able to look around and see those puffs on the water. And doing that in heavier breeze can kind of help you learn how to find out where breeze is. And one of the best things you can be doing as a crew is looking around, finding where the breeze is, telling your skipper where on the course looks fast, look at other boats, see what they're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Because that is probably another good point, is that it's easy for me to draw this up on the whiteboard and say, look, here's a puff. But especially, like you brought up, the more wind there is, the easier it is to see those puffs. But conversely, the less wind there is, which a lot of our sailing is in probably medium to light breeze. The lighter the wind, the harder it is to see those puffs. So when you're first starting out, it might not be I'm trying to time the puffs. It might just be I'm trying to identify what's a puff and what's just waves, that sort of thing. So it's definitely steps. So if you start out and then you're very confused as to just when the puffs are even coming, then yeah, certainly that's a step that kind of has to be taken. All right. Any last things before we sign off here? All right. Well, hearing none, welcome to everybody who's this is their first Chalk Talk. Hopefully, we'll see you at many more. We're basically doing these. I guess I hope unless anything changes, we'll just keep doing these. Every weekday, 3 p.m. Everybody's welcome every day. I'll have stuff like this. We'll have stuff about tactics. We'll talk about rules. 2 days, I think it was 2 days ago, we read a little bit out of one of the books I was reading about kind of the philosophy behind, not philosophy, but the mindset behind racing at a high level. So a whole bunch of different stuff, and we'll make it applicable for everybody, whether you're in Green Fleet or racers. So certainly hope to see you back, and I will see you all tomorrow at 3.
And then, are we gonna do Friday Night Bites again?
Yeah, may as well. I'll whether I actually sit in with you guys, I will certainly turn on a Zoom meeting and let it run.
All right. So all the new Zoom people plug in that.
Yeah, I guess yeah, Friday Night Bites. If you never went to a physical Friday Night Bites, is we just turned on the Zoom meeting and people ate food or cooked food or just hung around and talked or just hung around and listened. But certainly just kind of just getting that group going on, and it's cool. All right, I will see you all tomorrow at 3.